Okay, we're on to the very last video recording for Chapter 18, Imperialism, and particularly looking at Africa. So this one is about North Africa, and as with all of the other videos on European colonization in Africa, we're looking at this from a perspective of the historical thinking skill change in continuity over time. So we're breaking up European colonialism into these three categories: the early, the middle, the end. So what's early contact like? Then what is the initiation like of colonial control, and how do they maintain it afterwards? And then finally, what are the responses of the colonized people to this new system of European colonialism? So once again, we're looking at it from this type of perspective: early, middle, end. And with the early contact, we have to remember that in North Africa, this is going to be slightly different than what we saw in the rest of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, or South Africa. In North Africa, there is never any of the coastal European settlements the way you saw in the rest of Africa. And the question becomes, why do we not see these coastal European settlements in North Africa, but we do throughout the rest of Africa, right? And the answer to that, of course, is Islamic control. The Ottoman Empire extended all throughout North Africa, and the Europeans, until the Ottoman Empire starts to decline, till this period, the Europeans were never able to defeat them. Okay, so only after the Ottoman Empire starts to decline do we actually see some European influence in North Africa. Okay, so it's all because of the Ottoman weakness. Now, what we see then are two different things. In Tunis and Algeria, which if you take a look at the map, you can see that they are in red, so is Egypt. The way that Europeans become introduced to Tunis and Algeria is going to be different from Egypt. So in Tunis and Algeria, it's pirates, right? When the Ottoman Empire weakens, pirates become prevalent in the Mediterranean, and that's affecting everyone's trade. So France for Algeria and America for Tunis are going to use that as justification to come in. In Egypt, however, it's very similar to South Africa. We're seeing people come in, particularly the British, because of the Napoleonic Wars. They come into Egypt to defeat the French. And remember, Napoleon does invade Egypt. Okay, now let's look at how the Brits in particular initiate and then maintain their colonial control in Egypt. So the context for Egypt is that around the same time that the Ottoman Empire is weakening, we see a leader in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, who is formally working for the Ottomans. The weakening of the Ottoman Empire allows him to take control. Okay, so he gains some autonomy, some control out of the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. So we see here that initially it's not the Europeans coming in and taking over Ottoman territory. It's the people who are native to Egypt kind of rising up and taking control over their own nation. So Muhammad Ali is very much, considered to be like a nationalist leader for Egypt. What he does is he follows the pattern that most successful nations are going to do. They modernize. And in this case, that was westernization, right? So Europe is the one who had industrialized first. So everybody's going to copy those methods of modernization. Everyone who's successful is going to copy those methods of modernization. And Muhammad Ali does that with bringing in educational systems that are very similar to the West. Remember, you need this as part of your industrialization project. You need public government-run schools. He's also going to embrace the printing press. Once again, kind of a precursor to industrialization. He's going to westernize the military, and he's going to westernize the economy somewhat, right? So here's his mistake, and really his only mistake, is that he focuses on the production of raw cotton. And this is very similar to India. They see a huge market in England for raw cotton. So they're going to focus on that because it's going to make them a ton of money, right? Now, the way he gets further into trouble is that Britain, because they want the raw cotton, is going to help to fund some of the industrial projects, particularly irrigation, that Egypt needs in order to really amp up their production of raw cotton. So Britain starts to loan them money. And as we know, this is a trap of European neo-colonialism. It's a really brilliant thing to do. Get them in debt to you, then that gives you a reason for coming in and taking over part of their economy. So this is fine for Britain. They love loaning people money until Egypt wants to develop their own textile factories. That's where things get scary for Britain because now they could be competition, right? And the reason that the factories in Egypt are going to pose a threat and be considered competition is because they could produce cotton textiles more efficiently in Egypt because they don't have to rely on somebody else for the raw cotton. They have the raw cotton. If they'd have the industry as well and the factories, then they could produce cotton textiles much more efficiently than England could. So this is where England makes its next move and moves into full-blown neocolonialism. Egypt falls behind a little bit on their debt. So what they do is they create a commission of debt, which is a group of Europeans that are going to go into Egypt and basically say, okay, if you can't pay back our debt, we're going to temporarily take over your economy. And this is met with a lot of revolts. So this commission of debt is actually backed up by military force. And later, then the Europeans are able to get Egypt even more into debt by building the Suez Canal. So it's just full-blown neocolonialism from that point on for Egypt. Not a settler colony. It's indirect control through neocolonialism. And that's in stark contrast to what we see the French doing in Algeria, which is our other big case study for North Africa. In Algeria, it's very similar to South Africa. Africans are forbidden from owning land, and therefore they cannot vote. This disenfranchises them and puts the French people on top. Now, Algeria, as I just mentioned, unlike Egypt, becomes a major settler colony. The culture of Algeria, even today, has so many French attributes, and that's because it became like a little France in North Africa. So people were migrating there from France, living there, and the culture was really being changed to become more French. You see elements of that with Egypt just because of the neocolonialism, but it's not to the extent that we see in Algeria, which differentiates the two, settler colony versus indirect control through neocolonialism. So North Africa, two countries directly next to each other, but using two very different strategies. France, settler colony; England, neocolonialism, indirect control. Okay, what are the responses of the colonized people? Well, we see a lot of similarities to what was happening throughout the rest of Africa, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. So you see Islam, religion, becoming this thing to unify people again. So you have all of these Islamic revivalist rebellions against the Christian Europeans who are coming in. In fact, in Algeria and Morocco, that region, we have Abd al-Qadir launching all of these Islamic revivalist rebellions. He, of course, is going to be defeated by the French, once again, because of industrialization and the lack of weapons. And then in Ethiopia in the southern part of Egypt, in Sudan in the southern part of Egypt, we have the Mahdis, who are defeated by Britain. And here's where you see a lot of the religious beliefs coming into play. This is where they thought they were going to be protected, right? And the Brits just gunned them down with the machine guns. It's absolutely awful. Once again, illustrating the power of industrialization. And then in addition to that, we know that in Egypt there are revolts right after the Commission of Debt is formed, and that the British government is going to use violence and going to use the military and force to suppress those after the Commission of Debt is established. So once again, we see here in North Africa things very similar to the rest of Africa in that you have armed rebellions, often which are going to be defeated simply because of the impact of industrialization. And this is another reason why we say industrialization is such a major turning point for world history, is that for the first time, this new technology really creates a huge gap between countries. Whereas in the past, the gaps that were created by new technology were much, much smaller and more easily overcome. So industrialization is a huge turning point. And then in addition to the violence and force and armed rebellions, we see the Islamic revivalist rebellions, which are also armed, but particularly using religion. As opposed to like nationalism, using religion as a way to unify the people. So this is North Africa. Now, a few things I want to point out here just to recap everything. Africa, much more tribally based. That's going to be a significant factor when comparing these three cases, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Africa, to what's happening in India and in China in particular. So we're going to see some stark contrast there due to the type of society. As opposed to huge empires, we're seeing smaller tribal communities and things like that. In addition to that, we're seeing neocolonialism, particularly in Egypt. We are seeing settler colonies, particularly in Algeria and South Africa. They are our best examples of settler colonies. And then we see a whole host of different types of strategies being used in sub-Saharan Africa. In the case of Belgium, you're seeing slave plantations be recreated. In the case of like West Africa, the Igbo people, things fall apart. We're seeing a lot of hegemony being used, and hegemony was really the dominating factor. Bring in Christianity, but also bring in schools. When you bring in those schools, link those schools to jobs in the colonial government, allowing for greater cooperation with the African people, keeping in mind the whole time that you've created this invisible glass ceiling so that they cannot advance too far. So manipulating the system to your advantage, but giving people some benefits, particularly people who didn't have benefits earlier on in African society. So this is Africa, a lot of strategies being used, a lot of different types of colonies being created as well. You'll want to know in particular the strategies used in Egypt, the strategies used in Algeria, and the strategies used in South Africa in order to initiate and maintain control. So you need to know stuff about the diamond mines and the gold mines, Kimberley and Witwatersrand in South Africa, the way they manipulate taxes and then separate families and villages, keeping people moving from one mine to the other. That's key. In Egypt, you want to know about the modernization process and the fact that Britain is going to loan money until factories are going to be established. Then they create the Commission of Debt and move to full-blown neocolonialism. And you want to know in Algeria that they're gaining control mainly through the control of land and who can and cannot own land, and therefore who can and cannot vote. And that was very similar to an earlier step in South Africa as well. So those are the three big ones, but you do want to know about the others as well. The violence, the hegemony that's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and predominantly this reaction of Islamic revivalist rebellions and outright armed warfare, particularly in Egypt and among the Zulu people with Shaka in the south. So the responses, the key ones, Islamic revivalist movements, armed rebellions in Egypt and down in South Africa with Shaka Zulu, and then finally the cooperation, because that was a response as well. Cooperation, converting, taking these jobs, going to the British and French schools in order to get the jobs, and then kind of getting trapped in this system where you can't move further up. But it has this illusion of power, this illusion of control. Okay, all right, the next videos that you will find then are going to be on India and China and Southeast Asia.